Week 2 of this quarter's speaker series, which is looking at how United States not-for-profit organizations operate abroad. What drives them, what motivates them, what restrains them, what or who are they accountable to, and what do they achieve? Last week we had Doug Rutson give a wonderful introduction to the speaker series. He made 2 points. One is that the not-for-profit world is the representative of civil society. They're not government. Government has a very established role within a nation state. It deals with other governments. It deals with its own citizens. And whilst government is supposed to represent citizens' views, it doesn't necessarily do that to the whole extent that citizens want their views represented. The second more disturbing point that Doug made last week is that many governments, our own included, are using their own constitutions and the principle of the rule of law to close down NGOs, especially those who are promoting civil and political rights, such as freedom of speech. So we live in a time where we take NGOs for granted, in a sense, as part of our landscape. We have governments that look after formal activities that we associate with foreign policy and rolling out legislation at home. The private sector makes money and provides jobs, but we really do rely on the not-for-profit sector to fill the many, many gaps where we think that either government doesn't do enough or we feel that the private sector is sometimes doing too much for itself and not enough for we, private citizens. The point of week 2 tonight is to get us into more of the internal machinations of how not-for-profits actually work on a day-to-day basis. So we have 2 people talking to us tonight. One at the macro level, Nick Deychakiwsky, who comes to us from Mott Foundation, and Maurice Middleberg, who comes from Free the Slaves. Nick is going to give us that macro perspective of a large philanthropic endeavour that works around the world on many, many areas, some of which are human rights and many are not human rights. There are other sorts of projects and endeavours around the world. Maurice's perspective is on a single issue NGO that's identified one single human rights violation which the organisation is pursuing as its single agenda. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Nick from the Mott Foundation has spent a lot of time working in Ukraine. He's spent a lot of time in Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, managing the International Management Institute and the Council of Advisors to the Parliament of Ukraine, and the Soros Foundation, which in the form that Nick was running it, advising in it, was called the International Renaissance Foundation and the Eurasia Foundation. So here you have someone who's now in a senior position with lots and lots of experience and is in charge of an organisation that has many, many operations around the world. Nick also has some handouts that I think Dana has handed out to you, and which, if you need spares, are down the front here. Maurice comes to us from Free the Slaves, which is a not-for-profit based in Washington, D.C., working on modern-day slavery. Free the Slaves has operations in Latin America, in Africa, and also in Asia. Maurice has also worked in the health sector at CARE, at the Global Health Council, in Gender Health and Intra-Health, and also for USAID. The format for tonight is the same as last week, but with 2 people, so it's a jam-packed program. Nick's going to kick off, give us the big picture, talk for about 20 minutes, and then Maurice is going to follow. We'll have an exchange up here, and then we have 2 roving mics for some Q&A at the end. So without further ado, Nick. Welcome to Stanford.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Helen. Thank you for that warm introduction. And I mean warm because I'm from Michigan, and it is just such a treat being in 55-degree weather rather than 5-degree weather with wind chills at -15 or something like that. So I'm very happy to see you. So to be clear, I'll be speaking about NGOs mainly from a funder's perspective. So Maurice, you might need to correct me later on. And a private foundation at that. I'll use the term NGO, a non-governmental organization, but if you prefer, there's PVOs, private voluntary organization, CSOs, civil society organizations, NPOs, nonprofit organizations, and probably a few other kinds of O's that this category of organizations are referred to. So, it's not easy being an NGO nowadays, and I suppose it never was. But here's why I think it's even more challenging today than ever before. Firstly, we're living in a more connected world. It's harder to be just off doing your own thing in your own little corner. People will learn about it, they'll share about it, they'll get ideas about it, they'll copycat it. So you can't easily be isolated. I mean, not that you'd want to be, because as an NGO, the whole point is to get to be known better so that you can help more people. But, number two, competition for funding is greater. It's become easier than ever for funders, whether they be governments, foundations, corporations, or even the hit the donate button, here's my 20 bucks individual givers, to know about who else is doing the same or very similar things. So people can shop around and compare who they want to give money to. Unless you've built a strong, recognizable brand, it can be hard to get noticed amongst all the choices. And nowadays, research shows that people, especially younger ones, are more attuned to causes and less loyal to organizations. Number three, everyone wants impact. That's the word of the day in the nonprofit world. Or so it seems. Gone are the days that an NGO can just claim to be doing God's work and that was enough. The pressure to show results, to maximize efficiency, to measure your results, to prove effectiveness, it's all greater all the way up and down the social resources chain. So showing these results, showing impact is easy for some, much, much harder for others, for example, for human rights organizations. And fourthly, revenue models are shifting. Governments, what they will or will not fund is changing. How money comes in is different. I mean, although it's not just about whether your donations come online versus a check in the mail, there's other things, like there's greater expectations of corporate social responsibility. We now have crowdfunding. And funders are increasingly emphasizing sustainability of organizations. And that means that NGOs nowadays are routinely expected to generate revenue by selling products or services. Now, how easy is that for a human rights organization? And by the way, with today's information technology, where you can just ask Google, right? It's become harder for NGOs to sell information, which used to be one of the things that would be more easily or relatively easily create a revenue stream. So it's not easy being an NGO, and by the same token, it's not an easy thing working for an NGO either. You do get the satisfaction of working for a good cause, of changing the world for the better, of doing more than just toiling away for some company to make profits. But on the other hand, you'll need to be working with an organization that faces some of the challenges I was just raising. Unless, of course, you just want to start shop up all by yourself, hang out your own shingle, be that innovative social entrepreneur. but it's not an easy path to success, given what I was saying before about living in a very connected world. It's just getting harder and harder to be unique. As I was telling my teenage son when he was applying for a job this summer, you and 100 others. So now, from the inside, the NGO may feel an awful lot like a business with its own systems, rules, procedures, policies, administration, bureaucracy, revenue streams. But it has a social mission. It aims to make life better for people. It stands for something. There is value, and there are values. And this leads me to the topic of accountability. That's a word that's heard very often in the NGO world, repeated especially often by funders. Now, there are all kinds of accountability, all sorts of definitions. I like to go with one of them that I found online, and that's accountability is the willingness and ability to answer to and take responsibility for one's actions, decisions, and messages. Answerability, liability, culpability. It's not just transparency, which is openness, disclosure, and dissemination of information about an NGO's values, processes, and procedures. And it's more than legitimacy, which is the perception by others of an NGO's actions being justifiable and appropriate. As for the various kinds of accountability, here are just some of them that I read. Moral, administrative, managerial, market, social, political, judicial, legal, professional, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, personal, shared, process, outcome, and on and on. A lot of words get placed before the word accountability. Now, to me, there are three basic ways of looking at it. One is compliance, not only to the law, but to funder requirements. Secondly, there are society's expectations. Are you doing what you say you'll be doing? And third is intrinsic. Are you true to your mission and to your organization's core values? So, let's examine one model put forth by a global organization called Civicus on the levels of accountability for NGOs. The first they define is upward, and that's to donors and regulators. Second is downward, and that's to beneficiaries. Although I wish it'd be flipped, that upwards to beneficiaries and downwards to donors. But anyway, that's the way they put it. The third is outward, and that's to peers, members, if you're a membership organization, or to other partners. And the fourth is inward, to your staff, to the board, to volunteers. Now, there's a fifth that I'm missing here, although I don't quite know which direction it should be in. It might be a combination of the downward and the outward, and that's to the community you're working in or to society as a whole. And here I'm going to get on a soapbox a little bit. I think that too often accountability to community and to society gets lost in the shuffle, and particularly in international development. Too often, funders and large NGO program implementers come to a place with the best of intentions, but don't sufficiently engage the beneficiaries or the communities that they live in. So there ends up being no local accountability built into whatever the development process is. There, I've gone ahead and put another word before accountability. Sorry about that. So either the development intervention isn't quite the right one, maybe the experts didn't factor in various cultural or social or other circumstances, or there's no local buy-in. People don't understand it, they don't own it, and so they'll abandon it as soon as the outsiders and their resources go away, or sometimes even earlier. I and the funding organizations I've worked for have been guilty of this many times, and frankly, no doubt, often still are. because it's not always a simple black, white, either or thing. I can give you a few examples later if you'd like, as well as one of the ways that we ourselves are trying to behave differently and encourage others to do so is in one of the areas we work in called community philanthropy, and that's that little blue brochure that was handed out to you. Now, in fact, it isn't always just the outsiders that are the culprits. In the mid-2000s, early and mid-2000s, I had the experience of working with Russian human rights organizations. And inspiring because it was some of the most noble, courageous, and principled people I've ever met. But they weren't particularly accountable to Russian society. It's a conundrum because they cared deeply about the people of Russia. And they were also trying to change their attitudes. But they weren't very accountable to society. So we can talk about this more later if you'd like as well. I'm going to move on. Back to the outsiders. As illustrated in a very neat book, and it's on that list, that other sheet I pointed out a bunch of resources that you might look at, the web links to them. A book called Time to Listen, Hearing People on the Receiving End of International Aid. This lack of accountability to community or society isn't necessarily because people working for the various funders or NGOs are patronizing know-it-alls. Typically, it's because they have to be mindful of the upward accountability, particularly to funders, especially if those funders are governments, development agencies, or foundations. Undergoing a process where you're really engaging a community, where you're working to develop people's capacity, where you're tapping into their knowledge, where you're involving them in the design, not just the implementation, but the design of whatever your intervention is. Looking at whatever solution you're proposing in a holistic fashion, which might mean addressing more than just the particular concern that you've been contracted to do. All these things take time, effort, and money. So doing that is really not easy when there's a lot of pressure to show efficiency, results, and impact, especially short-term impact. Now, mind you, accountability can mean different things to different stakeholders. And it's very important to recognize that. For example, too often NGOs think accountability means pumping out more information, more numbers, more lists, more charts, more graphs, more reports, more analyses. And that might be true in the case of upward accountability, although as a program officer, I sometimes say, enough, you know, just give me the executive summary, not the whole thing, right? But not at other levels. For example, good downward accountability might mean something as simple as picking up the phone when it rings and being available to answer a community member's question. That's nicely described in another neat publication that's on the list called Don't Count Us Out, How an Over-Reliance on Accountability Could Undermine the Public's Confidence in Schools, Businesses, and more, and even in NGOs, I'll add that. So it's easy for an NGO to put upward accountability first, and it's hard not to get caught in a trap of being only about that. And I can give examples about that too later. That's part of the dilemma. Ignore what the regulators want and you can be shut down. Ignore what the funders want and you can be out of money. As for downward accountability, well, disregard it and your NGO might not be able to achieve what it wants to over the long term. Outward accountability, if you don't consider what your peers and partners are doing, you'll soon be isolated. Inward accountability, well, neglect your staff, board, and volunteers, and you'll be ineffective. Or if you're the director, you'll soon be out of a job. So the various levels of accountability don't always line up. I mean, it's fantastic when they do, but more often an NGO has to try to manage these tensions amongst being accountable to the various stakeholder groups. Not just once, but constantly. So in order to be successful to an NGO's mission over time, you need to be in relationships with the various stakeholders. And being accountable to all of them is a balancing act, better managed by operating relationally rather than transactionally. And by the way, accountability is different in different countries. That's another issue that, again, if we have time in the discussion, I can illustrate. So what is the lodestar that maximizes NGO accountability? In my opinion, it's being constantly mindful and true to one's mission. And actually, not only to your mission, but to your core values. Frankly, it's that integrity to core values that could even cause a slight shift in mission without compromising accountability, especially in cases where a mission might have been defined too narrowly. An NGO needs to be constantly raising for itself the questions: to whom, accountable to whom, for what, how, and even why. So being accountable is constantly learning. It's a process. Let me conclude these remarks by stating that after highlighting the dilemmas faced by NGOs using accountability as the focus point, I hope I've not discouraged anyone who is so inclined to work at an NGO. I just want you to be aware that A, going off and starting your own is doable, but can be extremely challenging. It's not always the best route. And B, working for an NGO isn't easy either. And I've just illustrated some of the dilemmas. However, working at an NGO can give you some very valuable experience in case you do want to start up one of your own someday. Whether it's your own or someone else's, you'll also have to try to figure out your personal accountability. There I go, putting a qualifier on the word again. But that accountability to the NGO, to its mission, to its stakeholders, to community and society. And as with the NGO, I believe so with the individual. The most successful ones are those that, while balancing all the tensions, remain true to their core values. Thank you.
Oops. Coming undone already. Nick, that was great. Thanks. All right, Nick, thank you. What a terrific setup for the next, and I think you'll find a lot of overlap. Helen, thank you so much for the invitation, and to CDDRL for this very gracious invitation, for the honor of being here. I think you're going to find actually a lot of overlap, and we did not coordinate in any way between what I'm going to describe with regard to my organization, Free the Slaves, and sort of the general panorama that Nick laid out. So what Helen asked me to do was to talk about, she said in her introduction, how does an NGO like Free the Slaves actually operate, and how do we hold ourselves accountable, and to whom? So what I'm going to talk about today is how we actually work, and I'm going to use what we call the triangle. And I want to preface this by saying that this is a subject for which I get a great deal of teasing at Free the Slaves. What I'm showing you is the actual framework that we apply at Free the Slaves to manage the organization, and my team frequently comes up to me and goes, "Yes, Maurice, we know, we get it, the triangle, it's the triangle." And we see three elements to the triangle. And those are impact, financial health, and organizational vitality. And I want to explore each of these with you and how they are essential to the fulfillment of our mission and vision. Now, the mission of Free the Slaves is to liberate those in slavery and to change the conditions that allow slavery to persist. Here's the challenge that every NGO like mine faces, is you say that, and then there is the danger of mission creep. Because the conditions that, remember I used that word, the conditions that allow slavery to persist are quite complex, they're numerous, There are very sophisticated linkages among those conditions. And there is always the impetus when you are a social justice organization to have a diffusion of effort trying to touch on every conceivable cause of the problem that you're trying to fix, which in our case is slavery. So one of the things you have to be able to do is have a mission that is both clear and focused enough that you can actually accomplish something. Now that also has to be accompanied by a vision of how the world will change as a result of your efforts. And we're actually just beginning a process that we're calling Vision 2025 to set forth a 10-year vision for Free the Slaves. And we're asking two basic questions. One is, what is the state of the anti-slavery movement today? What's going well? What's not going well? What have we learned? What don't we know? Who are the players? What are the roles in which they're engaged? And really develop that landscape of the anti-slavery movement as it now exists. And then the second question will be, what is the appropriate role for Free the Slaves? Given the state of the anti-slavery movement, given our capacities and weaknesses, how can we be of greatest service to the anti-slavery movement? And this is a process that's going to take involving a whole array of stakeholders to get a coalescing of views around what the vision, our 10-year vision, should be. So mission and vision are at the center of the triangle. There are challenges associated with each. But let's just stay with that mission then of liberating slaves and changing the conditions that allow slavery to persist. And the first question is, well, what is the impact that we're actually having on that? And here's the way that we have tackled that question of impact. The first piece has been to try to elucidate our causal model, our if-then statements, our hypotheses about what actions we might take that would actually have a material impact on slavery in highly affected countries. And in brief, our model, and I could talk about this alone for 2 hours, our model says that if we build the capacity of local NGOs that are serving at-risk communities, they in turn will be able to do 3 things. They will educate and mobilize at-risk communities where slavery is present or where there's a high risk of slavery, that they will improve the legal protections afforded at-risk communities, and that they will be able to affect some of the social conditions, such as lack of access to credit or schools or health care, that put people at risk and lead them down a road to slavery. Now, the elucidation of causal models is actually fairly rare for human rights organizations. It's very common in other domains like public health, which is where I spent most of my career. But this is not typically the way that human rights organizations have approached determining what their impact will be. But we have found this to be extremely helpful because once you elucidate the causal model, the if-then series of statements, that what that allows one to do is to then say, well, these are the variables that we're going to track, and that we have then identified indicators that are associated with every variable in the model, develop metrics that go with those indicators, and had to develop, because this has not been done before, we have had to develop new data gathering instruments in order to carry out the measurement. Now, there are obviously technical challenges in getting all that done. It's also very costly to develop new indicators, new monitoring and evaluation tools and methods, and then carry out the data collection and the analysis is quite costly. And not all donors are particularly interested in paying for that. They would like to see accountability, but paying for this kind of research is a different question. But let's say we are able to demonstrate impact in the communities that we we are able to serve. The next challenge that comes about is taking that impact to scale. Our budget is about $3 million a year. We're a small organization. And let's say in the 1,200 or so communities in which we operate, that we're able to demonstrate impact. That will only have a minor effect on the tens of millions of people who are in slavery. So what we'll need to be able to do then is to move our model to scale, which then creates the need for advocacy. So this is the last part of our impact schema, if you will, is taking the evidence that we accumulate, being able then to turn that into a strategy of persuasion that will move governments and much larger organizations to adopt new and better strategies for fighting slavery. So you have this bundle of work, if you will, that is associated with having a good strategy for achieving impact. And this is a challenge that every NGO faces, every human rights organization faces, is being able to lay out clearly its theory of change and then being able to measure whether or not that theory of change is actually effective. But that's only one part of what an NGO like Free the Slaves is faced with. Here's the second thing, and I will tell you that people in my position probably spend half their time on this issue, which is ensuring the financial health of the organization. You have to grow. There's no such thing as staying static if you're going to be an NGO. It's like any business. You're either growing or dying. So you have to have a strategy for financial growth. You have to identify what your market is. You have to segment that market. You have to build relationships with the customers in that market. And that is something that every NGO lives with. Beyond that, you have to ensure that there is sufficient diversification of the streams of revenue. One of the things that happens to NGOs like mine is they become overly attached to a small set of donors, and if one of them falls by the wayside and decides for whatever reason they don't want to support you anymore, the organization becomes highly vulnerable. So it's not only the total revenue that comes into play, but the diversity of sources of revenue. So you have restricted funding, you have unrestricted funding, you have different kinds of restricted funding, and all of that are sort of the daily preoccupations of people who are in my role and worry about running an organization. But once the money comes in the door, there's a third set of challenges, and those have to do with the allocation of resources. Now, this is very far from straightforward. In part, the discretion that managers of NGOs have is often, in fact, quite limited because in the case of my organization, we're actually fairly well off. 80% of the money that comes in is in the form of restricted grants. That is, the money can only be used for purposes negotiated with the donor, and so you don't have flexibility over moving money from one pot to another. In our case, about 20% is unrestricted funding. So you have to then, with the funds that are flexible, you have to have criteria for the allocation of those resources. So for example, we have said that our benchmark is that 80% of our total budget should go into programs and only 20% should go into fundraising and administrative costs. And these are the kinds of criteria that are then laid out for the allocation of resources. And that too is a challenge. And the fourth area that is a preoccupation has to do with sustaining the reputation of the organization. Nick referred to the fact that we live in a highly connected world. That is certainly true, and part of what that means is that reputations can be damaged extremely quickly, justly or unjustly. And so one of the things that we're always doing is being very careful about our relationship with our stakeholders, our relationship with our constituencies, building those relationships. So if some untoward event does happen, that we're able to rely on those relationships, as well as to have a crisis management plan in place so that if some event happens, there's an incident that might cast negative views of the organization, we're able to respond to that in a prompt and effective way. The third major piece that we pay attention to is what I'm calling here organizational vitality. And here there are three major buckets of work. One has to do with structure. How is the organization structured? Where do the boxes fit and who's in what box? Let me give you a concrete example of having structure follow function. When I came into Free the Slaves, we had a research department. And the function of that department had been to carry out basic research about slavery. The magnitude of slavery, the dynamics of slavery, how to fight slavery. But it wasn't well tied to our country programs. So one of the things we did is to elect to change the research department into a monitoring and evaluation department and hire a new director of monitoring and evaluation with a very different skill set from the kind of person who would do, if you will, pure research on the magnitude and dynamics of slavery. So we're shifting the structure of part of the organization to fit with our need for better evaluation and our need to demonstrate impact. There's a second component here, which is what I've termed management systems. And this is the unglamorous, unsexy part of running an NGO. This is your financial management, your personnel system, your information system. And frankly, most people who come into the NGO world, this is not what they think about. But let me tell you that this is the arena most likely to lead to catastrophe for an organization. NGOs tend to underinvest in management systems. Donors, by and large, are not particularly interested in supporting management systems. They are costly. People are shocked when I tell them that I had to budget this year for the audit, and everybody wants to see an audited financial statement, as they should, to be sure that our books are clean. That contract cost me $24,000 just to get the audit done. Now, that's a lot of money. But those are the kinds of costs that we do incur just to keep the organization running properly. And if you don't pay attention to those management systems, that's the thing that's most likely to get you into trouble. And the last piece is what I've termed here organizational culture. And every organization does have a very distinctive culture. There's this almost unwritten set of assumptions and rules about that's not how we do things here, or this is the way we do things here. This is what people get rewarded for. This is what people get ostracized for. But you really have to be conscious of the culture and be sure that you, in a very conscious way, trying to construct a culture that actually supports the mission, fits the people who are in the organization, works well with the external environment, and also, frankly, works well with the personality of the leader. So what I'm trying to present here in a very brief way are the multiple dimensions that are involved in actually running an NGO. Each of these bullets that I've treated in a very cursory fashion has enormous challenges associated with it. And beyond that, and this is the last point that I really want to emphasize, is that each of those buckets has a very different overlapping constituency. Nick talked about the fact that there are these diverse stakeholders, and that is certainly very much exactly the experience that we have. So when you look at the impact bucket, well, that's our peers are interested in that, our donors are interested in that, our partners are interested in that. But there's a very different group that's interested in our financial health, a very different group that is interested in our management systems. And those constituencies don't necessarily agree. In fact, one of the challenges of running an NGO is that there is often conflict among those constituencies. For example, you as the technical person may think, well, this is what is in the best interest of achieving impact. that may not be the same thing that the donor is interested in funding. You may have the programmatic staff that is at odds with the finance staff in terms of the allocation of resources. So there are all these different stakeholders that circle around these three buckets, and there's frequently conflict among them. And the essential challenge is to try to align all of the stakeholders in a way that supports the mission and vision of the organization. Now, I've talked a lot here about the challenges of running an NGO because I want you to have an accurate portrait of what is actually involved. But I want to conclude on a much more positive note by saying that this kind of work can be enormously gratifying and lead to incredibly important results. I can't cite the data for 2014 because we don't have those yet, but I can tell you that in 2013, that our little organization, our $3 million a year organization, was able to document the rescue of over 3,100 people out of slavery. We worked with 1,200 community groups. We trained over 1,500 police and government officials. Our work led to the arrest or prosecution of 105 perpetrators. And very soon, we will be able to count the 10,000th person that we've been able to help rescue from slavery. All of that makes me believe that we are in fact faithful to our mission and our values, and that we are accomplishing what we set out to accomplish. But getting there requires bringing together all of these pieces that I have described for you. And when that works, it is enormously satisfying and gratifying. So with that, I'll close, and thank you for your attention.
So Nick and Maurice, if I can invite you to join me up here. I'm struck by the similarity, notwithstanding that Mott and Free the Slaves are radically different in their reach and their diversity, that both of you are telling a cautionary tale, if you will, that as much as there's, I think, great interest, certainly in the Stanford student body, certainly in those who see that part of their role in life is to do more than just pay their taxes and look after their own family, but it's also to contribute in concrete ways to expanding social welfare, wherever that might be, on whatever topic that might be, that organisationally it's just as complicated to run an NGO or philanthropic endeavour, perhaps even more so than a private commercial enterprise. And that secondly, overlapping constituencies, I think is a nice way of putting it, that to be in an NGO is to be constantly negotiating, if you will, many, many other people's visions of what the NGO should be doing. So, okay, that's a cautionary tale, and yet you're encouraging, if you will, Stanford students to think about working in one, maybe even starting one. If I could start, Nick, by drilling down a little bit on local accountability, because I'm always asking myself these questions about what systems NGOs can put into place to ensure that, with the best will in the world, that NGOs and philanthropic endeavours don't simply go into a new place hoping to improve life in some dimension, but either go in a ham-fisted way, or go in an arrogant way, or simply go in with insufficient information, and at best they might do no good at all, and at worst they may do some harm. So what are some of the systems that you can talk about, Nick, that ensure that local accountability is really part of the infrastructure of an organisation. NGOs, although they have many legal requirements to Inland Revenue, and they have accountability to their donors and accountability to their own employees, in a way you're really so untethered from any sort of bigger template such as the government has of what it's expected to do on that particular topic. You're really just on a frolic of your own. And the extent to which you may engage with people on the ground is really the extent to which you as an organisation decide that you think that's important. Some organisations are going to do it well and some are going to do it not so well. The ones that don't do it terribly well, as long as they have lots of money, there's nothing to stop them from just going on and doing the same old, same old. So, as outsiders, how are we to judge whether or not we should be giving our money to that philanthropy or applying for that job to that NGO when all it takes is to put some great stuff on a website with some photographs of here we are working with our local people, and here's a child who didn't go to school and now is going to school, or here's a soup kitchen that we've set up. How can we ever really know? Because you're not government, we can't vote you out, you're not accountable to us. It's really just what you choose to do yourself. So how should we assess that local accountability piece?
Wow. First of all, you've brought up what foundations often get accused of, and very rationally, because a foundation really doesn't have, other than a compliance accountability, has very little, because, you know, take our foundation. We have a large endowment, right? We say, well, we're going to spend it the way we think is best to spend it, and if we don't, what's going to happen? You know, not much. It's not like a business that has accountability in a sense that it's going to have less profits, its share price is going to go down, the investors are all going to come at it very quickly. So anyway, on the issue of local accountability, you know, I'll go back to this idea of values. And in fact, I have a hard time separating or putting an organization's values completely separate from the personal values. I think the best NGOs that I've seen or best people working in the civil society sector are ones that the two go together, that they're integrated in some way. So, because a lot of it is, there's no other external signals potentially of accountability other than here's what I believe and here's what our organization stands for. And not only what we're trying to achieve, but how we're trying to do it. You know, for me, respect of people and respect and dignity are at the core, have to be at the core of everything. And so, if I believe in that, and if my organization believes in that, which it does, we will go in and figure out, first of all, a way that we're respecting what people need, desire, what they say they want. So it's listening, it's having an attitude of listening, it's coming in and saying, we're not here to teach, we're here to learn. I have to say that on a personal level, that kind of saved me. I went to the former Soviet Union in 1990 for what I thought would be 1 year, turned into almost 10 years. But I didn't come in as the American who will teach these people how they should behave, because I came in and I said, tell me what you're all about. And I don't know why that happened, but that's what worked, because I came in and said, I'm here to learn, I'm not here to teach. So getting to the issue of accountability, one of the reasons it fits in well with this little brochure I handed out on community philanthropy, because that's one of the things that our foundation believes in, the value of community. and in the idea of setting up local philanthropic institutions, whatever they may be, a United Way, a community foundation, a giving circle, some kind of organizational vehicle where local resources can be brought together, brought together, pooled to meet local needs. And why is that important? Another lesson I had in life from teaching music, when I was talking with two other fellow instructors. I play this Ukrainian folk instrument called the bandura. But so one guy was saying to the other, the kids don't, they don't practice, the parents drop them off, they don't look after things. And so the other guy says to him, how much do you charge for a lesson? He says, well, only $3 a lesson. This was back in the 70s, $3 a lesson, huh? But only $3 because, we got this grant from the New York State Council of the Arts, and so it's subsidized, so we don't have to. And the other guy says, there's your problem. I charge $10 a lesson. They practice. And I believe in that idea that, there's got to be some kind of signal that people are committed to their own development. We need to support and help and nurture, but we also have to expect that they're going to contribute to their own development. And probably the easiest indicator of contribution is financial. It's not the only one, but that's kind of sometimes the hardest one when you're going to pull some money out of your pocket. So that's why we believe in this, although we want to be cognizant that there are other ways people give their time, their effort, their intellect, their treasure, their connections. There's all kinds of capital. But when a community finds financial resources and puts them in, then that's a strong signal that it really is meaningful to them. And it helps equalize the relationship between you coming in from the outside, and it helps keep us humble too, that we're not the only ones that, because the other thing is once the local people contribute, they're also saying, and I'm going to say what I want to say on how this thing should be done, right? I put my money in. I don't want it to be wasted. I don't want it to be stolen. I don't want it to be lost. And
it must feed into sustainability too. If they've got a skin in the game,
yes,
then they want that to be nurtured.
And that actually, and I've talked for too long, you got me on an exciting topic, so I'll stop after this. But that actually is a saving grace, I think, with trying to get other funders, whether they be development agencies or others, seeing that. Because to funders, it's often you say, oh, it's an exit strategy, and their ears perk up. Because every funder says, I'm not going to be here forever, right? So you set up a local framework for people to be contributing to their own development, and then a funder will say, okay, then it's easier for me to then eventually say that's, we're moving on to something else.
Just out of interest, what's your estimation of the number of donors, either to your organization or to NGOs and philanthropic endeavors in general, who, when they're making their tax-deductible donations at the end of the year and writing their checks, how many people in an affluent society such as our own would go through some sort of accountability website and check whether or not that particular organization is getting traction on the ground?
The best research that I've seen isn't answering that question directly, but has shown that most individual donors a foundation or an organization is different. We check,
Sure.
That's part of our due diligence
process. We taxpayers.
Yeah, but as taxpayers, the research shows that most individual givers actually don't do it too much. They rely more on kind of a loyalty. Oh, I'm going to give to Stanford University. I went there. There's a relationship there, or my friend told me or something. But actually going and doing that kind of due diligence, looking at does Free the Slaves, what's their impact? How many people have? People don't. Now that may be shifting because we live in this world of new information technology where data is more easily gathered, crunched, assembled, and people are getting more used to looking at it and seeing numbers. but still it's not there. Now there's some neat things going on. I just met with the head of an outfit called Great Nonprofits, which is like a Yelp for nonprofits. So you go online and you look, and you could give reviews of volunteers or donors and the like. There are also rating systems. I have qualms. There's a Charity Navigator.
Right.
There are other outfits, B&B Wise, Giving Alliance, or others that can tell you, give you some feedback about the nonprofits you might want to give to. There's even ones that deal with internationally. But still, it's not that well developed, you know, because we see the giving as sometimes it's more heart than the head. Okay, ideally you want to make the combination. You don't want to go too much head either, but I'll stop there because that's another question. But it's a combination of both.
So on that issue of heart versus head, Maurice, if I can turn to your theory of change point, because it strikes me that your theory of change is trying to de-emphasize the heart and emphasize the head. You want metrics, you want research that will give you indicators of impact, and you want to be able to tell a story about your organization's impact on the basis of data. And I wonder if that might be a paradox when it comes to an NGO. Governments are supposed to do very specific things for us as citizens, as organizations, as commercial endeavors. But often our attraction to an NGO is because we think the cause is good, and we think that either government shouldn't be involved in that cause because our theory of government doesn't map onto government spending our tax money on that cause, because let's say it's something that happens in the home, in the domestic sphere, and American politics has traditionally put a big barrier between the public sector and the commercial sector and the private sector. And that's probably why slavery can work so well after all, because it happens mostly in private. But it's still very much a matter of the heart that people have a reaction that says, slavery shouldn't be happening today. That happened back in ancient Egypt. It happened back at the time of the cane fields, and it happened in Jim Crow in the South, and it shouldn't happen today. And yet your theory of change is really trying to alter that paradigm. So say something more about that, and I'm particularly interested in whether you think this is a strategic necessity for NGOs in the future. How much of this is responding to a prescience about you needing to be far more accountable on the basis of facts and figures rather than tugging at heartstrings?
So I actually think it's both head and heart, and they're not in contradiction. The mission is what attracts the heart. People care deeply about the outrage, the cruelty of slavery. And so they seek an outlet for responding to that passion. That's also why our people come work at Free the Slaves. It's because that's what attracts them. But what keeps them, and here's where I would differ a little bit with Nick, is that it's probably true that the $20 donor doesn't spend a lot of time online doing research, and it's a rational economic calculus, because if I'm giving $20, I don't want to spend $50 of my time doing research online. But if I'm giving $1,000 or $5,000 or $10,000, then it becomes worth my time to do that. So as you go up the giving ladder, and certainly the institutional donors are paying attention to the metrics. But frankly, there's something much more fundamental here, and this is, for me, where the passion and the science meld. I can't get up in the morning without knowing whether we're making a difference. I mean, what is the point of coming to work? This is, we are animated by the passion. This is certainly true for all of my colleagues. We care deeply about it, But beyond that, we want to know whether we're actually making a difference. And so I will tell you, there's this notion of trying to clearly articulate our causal model, measure as effectively as we can. And it is very tricky and expensive. But I've had no resistance from the team about this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're all for it. Figuring out how to do it well is, you know, another level. And sometimes we have arguments about, well, how are we actually going to get this done, because it is complicated and expensive. But I don't see any contradiction between the two. I think they are mutually reinforcing. And the more that we are able to demonstrate that the trust that people put in us is well placed, that these are worthwhile investments, that if you take a leap of faith and invest in our organization, that generates real tangible returns that can be demonstrated through rigorous measurement, that bond of trust is reinforced, and the passion for our work is reinforced. So I really see those two working together.
Mm-hmm. So passion is something you look for in your potential employees and your current employees. Should I assume from that you expect the passion to make up the wage differential between that same individual whose talents, were they to sell them in the commercial sector, might give them double or triple or much more remuneration?
So our posture with regard to compensation is that we want to be at the median of like organizations. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those, we talked about sort of benchmark. You know, there's actually metrics infused throughout all of this, and this is sort of the art and science of managing an organization. So no one should think that they come into, and there have been egregious cases of abuse and so on, we're familiar with those. But no one should come into an organization like Free the Slaves and think, this is how I'm going to get rich. And nobody is under that illusion. I don't believe that you should come into an organization like ours and take a vow of poverty and become a monk. People have families and mortgages, and they're entitled to have a decent life. Mm-hmm. So we want to, and interestingly, there's a great deal actually of research around the motivation of people. And in my understanding, what the research shows is what you have to take off the table is the threshold level where people aren't able to care for themselves and their families. The wages have to be high enough where I'm having trouble actually feeding my family mm-hmm. on this, because then it becomes consuming and a preoccupation. But once you pass that threshold, that's not actually what motivates people. At least not the kind of people who want to come to work for Free the Slaves. Mm-hmm. We need to get past that threshold, which is what we try to do, and pay people fairly. And then it is the intrinsic motivation of the work, and that happens in two fundamental ways. And this is where I want to come back to the issue of culture. People come to work, stay at a place, thrive at a place because of the people they work with. You know, one of my managers, for very personal reasons, said, I have to do something different with her life. It was circumstances, and I understand them. The fact that, you know, her deputy came into my office crying that her manager was leaving, I mean, most people don't cry when your boss quits, right? And you know that, and that sense of, and we're, you know, it's real. We fight with each other. You know, we have disagreements.
Sound like my family at Christmas.
Right. But you know, I mean, it's real people in a real organization. But there is a dynamic of a very positive dynamic of relationships among the staff. We had a staff retreat, and I said to them, just as people were filing in the room, and they came from different countries and watching people, and I said to them, one of the great gratifications of my life is that when I just watch you and the way that you interact with each other, it's it's just wonderful to see. And I think that matters a very great deal to people. And I think the fact that they get professional satisfaction in being able to apply their skills, because the people on this team, it's not that they are only good-hearted, they're very good at what they do. They're highly skilled, whether they're attorneys or evaluation experts or financial managers. They're very good at what they do. And getting to apply those skills to a cause where we're able to demonstrate we're making a difference, that too is what keeps people at work.
Can I just add a point to that, because it relates to something that you said earlier. There's this perception that, everything in business, the people are more professional, more qualified, more competent, and that NGOs are just, or nonprofits,
soft, woolly.
Yeah, kind of, didn't quite make it, so they're doing this. If you read Jim Collins' Good to Great, and then he wrote another book, Good to Great in the Social Sector, he actually said this isn't really true, that indeed working in nonprofits, I think it's more of a function, even the amplitude and the size of the organization, that actually is tougher, and that the dynamic over the past few decades has been this kind of like, NGOs need to become more business-like. But now there's talk of, well, businesses kind of need to become more NGO-like. There's different sets of skills often that are needed, and that businesses could use while going the other way. So there is the issue of compensation. I think you end up paying for having this great satisfaction of doing good, hopefully beyond that level. But this idea that somehow you're in a nonprofit world, so you're less qualified, sorry, I know it might sound self-serving, but I think it's bunk.
Thank you, Nick. I would just like to add, if I might, to this, because I can't tell you that the next person who says to me, you need to be more business-like, is going to get a really pithy response, because it's just nonsense. This notion that being in the NGO world somehow implies a lack of rigor or skill or professionalism is absolutely preposterous. I've been fortunate, because before coming into the NGO world, I actually did a number of years with a for-profit consulting firm, got contracts from the government, and I also was an academic for a while, so I've seen sort of different, and this notion that one or the other is inherently better or smarter or more capable than the other is just ridiculous.
So a question for both of you. In the time that you've worked in these worlds, and each of you have worked in multiple worlds that are connected or quasi-connected to wishing to improve the aggregate of social welfare for others rather than accruing to your own benefit financially. You've also presumably observed that the number of NGOs have grown and grown and grown. How does this affect your own operations? How does it affect your own decision about precisely what your mission will be? Do you make an assessment of whether, well, we were working in this micro space over here, but in fact, this NGO that started up 5 years ago is doing a better job than we are? Or do you look at that and say, well, we're going to compete with them and we're going to do it better? How do you navigate in an increasingly complex field of NGO work that, as you've both noted, is increasingly connected? It's very simple for an NGO in one part of the world to have partners in another part of the world simply through social media. There may or may not be a financial exchange. There may or may not be a technical exchange, but there'll be some sort of tethering from here to there. How do you navigate amongst all of that and ensure that you are constantly shaping your own organization's endeavors to be mindful of improving competencies here and diminishing competencies there.
Mm-hmm. You want me to start?
Why not?
Okay.
Well, I can always default by saying, that's above my pay grade, that's for my management to decide. And the other default is that I work for a private foundation. We don't compete for funding. So, but let me give a more serious answer to the question is that I do believe there's no one answer. It just really, in a large way, depends where you're at. What are the circumstances, or what's the market, if you will? I hate I don't like bringing market language into the NGO world.
Why not?
I worry about the over-marketization of how our society works. We're starting to put everything in these kinds of terms that get to, everything seemingly being commercialized and being consumerized.
Doesn't that just make you a dinosaur? In another way of...
And I have an MBA, by the way, so...
Put differently, one might argue that that could be another package of outreach that will capture the generation that is precisely the generation that's living with that jargon, with that argot, with that mindset.
See, I don't know, because right now you're hearing a lot about sort of social entrepreneurship, about doing things for good, about trying to find ways to hybridize and bring the two together. And I have a true dilemma with that, because on the one hand, it's sort of like wanting to have your cake and eat it. I want to make a little profit, but I still want to do good for the world too. At the same time.
Are they at odds? Are they inextricably in conflict?
Not necessarily. For example, I think I've heard that it was said by Bill Gates at one time that more social good was brought to the world by Microsoft than the Gates Foundation will ever be able to do.
He may have had a vested interest in that.
He might, right. But, if you think of the work of nonprofits, likely has been made much more easier by, being able to. It is, and I want to believe that, as I heard a guy from even the American Enterprise Institute once say that, it's all about creating value. So we tend to say, well, business is all they are is they want that bottom line, more money, profits. But shouldn't they be more about, I'm going to somehow make life better for people, let's say a better healthcare product, or something that, so it should be more than just about the money, right? And on the other side, philanthropy, giving away money isn't just about giving away money, it's trying to find a way to add value. So I want to believe the two can come together, and yet there is so much examples of large corporation being just about the money. But in today's world, this kind of idea that there are hybrid organizations, that there are L3Cs, there's a legal form, that there are B corporations, that there is a way to combine some idea of getting a return in profit, as well as doing something for social benefit. And the younger generations that studies show that millennials and others are wanting to find a way to combine that. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also very suspicious. Maybe here's being a dinosaur comes out. Let me just quickly go back to the other question of. I'll tell you a bit from my experience. It's a dilemma. NGOs are growing, and again, I'm feeling a tension that my inclination is to support the mom and pop stores. I don't want to see the Walmartization of the world. On the other hand, I've been forced to say we don't have the capacity, staff capacity, to be studying every little intent in a particular area we're in, every little endeavor that's coming up, every small little NGO that's coming up. So we're going to have to go with the bigger and better that has been tried and true. Now, I've encouraged somebody like that to say, have a sort of like a skunk works in your shop, so you could test out those new ideas with the new entrepreneurs. But we don't have the process set to be funding all of the little guys. And it is a tough dilemma for me, because my inclination is to, give the upstarts the chance rather than going with the tried and true.
So let me come back to your original question and answer it through my discussion of our creating a 10-year vision for the organization. And you'll recall that what I described was that the first part of this is, in fact, understanding the landscape of the anti-slavery movement. And I don't think there's anything wrong with actually asking the question, well, given the panoply of organizations that are out there in this movement, how can we be of greatest utility? That strikes me as just a good, fair, thoughtful question that every organization ought to be asking itself. And that's the essence of what we're going to be doing between now and September, is to try to answer that question. And I also don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with competition. Somehow the idea that there shouldn't be competition among NGOs I think that's flawed, because it does make one sharper to know that there is competition out there.
And that's really competition for donor
competition
dollars
for donor
at the end of
dollars.
the day.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but it's more complicated than that, because it's not just the donor dollars come from, as I was trying to show with that triangle, they come from lots of other places, being able to show impact, having good management, having a positive culture, having all those other pieces that ultimately makes you an organization that donors want to put their dollars
viable.
Right. And there can be some really, so not only does it make you sharper, but, I once heard that when in dealing with competitors, there's only three things that you can do. One is to kill them, one is to run away from them, and the other is to merge with them. Now, by and large, the NGOs really don't try to kill each other in the same way that businesses try to put each other out of business. That's not, a sort of a deliberate strategy largely for NGOs. But the reality of competition does, I think, force, if you're being smart, you to think about those other two options of running away in the sense of figuring out what is the niche, the space where you are of greatest utility that isn't already being occupied fully. And the other is to consider partnerships, alliances, and mergers. And I actually think that one of the things, and frankly, I am, for any of you, and sorry to say this if any of you out there are considering it, I think what the world doesn't need is 1,000 more tiny NGOs popping up. I think what we ought to be thinking about is actually doing more mergers of NGOs, because there are so many quite modest size NGOs. I mean, we're $3 million a year, and for a human rights organization, we're actually considered pretty sizable. Now think about that. That's just, to put it in context, the estimate is that the profits from slavery, according to the ILO, are $150 billion a year. And we, Free the Slaves, are one of the leading players in the anti-slavery movement with our $3 million budget. So, we may be better served by actually building more partnerships and mergers, and it is something that I'm actively thinking about and pursuing and having conversations with people about, because I think that's actually something, and that is if you will, it's a competitive strategy.
If you see slavery as the competition, if you see the problem.
I see, well, the problem is, but the reality of a space where we're competing for very limited dollars.
Right. But where
how can we use those more effectively?
Understood, that you're aggregating the impact
exactly
when the phenomenon is so phenomenally large.
Right.
Okay. We do have 2 handheld mics, so it's open to you if you'd like to ask questions. So let's have mic 1 and mic 2, and then we'll come to the others. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you very much. In speaking of accountability and the many different forms of accountability, you use the word tensions, suggesting that there can be an NGO being pulled in many different directions. And your solution to this seemed to be for the NGO to stay true to who they are. And my question is, how far does this really extend? And also, does there become, unfortunately, a hierarchy among the different accountability forms? And also, is there sometimes, do we come across a need for compromise among those different forms of accountability?
Great. Let's take the second question as well. Take two at one time.
Sure. I actually have two questions, one for Nick and one for Maurice. The Nick question is simple. That is, what is the example of the best accountability you've seen in a nonprofit? And for Maurice, it's actually about going back to this discussion of the head and the heart, and that is, are you at all worried that with the contemporary sort of glitter of scientific respectability that the theory of change and that metrics and so forth has, that it's overlooking the unbelievable complexity of social causality, a number of variables, the tipping points, the stochastic nature of social change and so on, and that we're driven to this kind of scientific patina of rigor when it actually obscures the reality.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. Actually, precisely there, I think very, very frequently it's a question of compromises, of finding the balance. The first is the dilemma that an NGO faces for many funders that Maurice referred to, that so much funding is restricted, and he can't spend it on this because a grant was given for a project that says you can only spend it in this particular fashion. So he might be starved on some of the things that he needs to, buy some better financial software, or even, getting a piece of furniture for an employee so that their neck isn't aching, or or a little bit of travel money so that his director of evaluation can go to some seminar and learn a little bit more about the topic, to learn how to do data better. And in fact, there are lots of kind of outfits calling out philanthropy and other funders to say, give unrestricted money, give general or operating support rather than trying to. So that's the one big area. Compromises have to be made on achieving mission because the funders say it can only be used in this thing. And funders do need to have to act differently. Another is, the compromise that sometimes has to be made between what beneficiaries say they need and even what direct beneficiaries say they need and what larger society might say is necessary.
For example, can you exemplify that?
I'll go back to the Russian human rights organizations. They were thinking of, certain individuals who might have been, imprisoned in the past or political. Actually, let me go to the example of the ones I worked with. They were immigrant rights organizations in Russia, and they were doing everything for the immigrants who were typically non-Russian, coming in from the Caucasus Republic or Tajikistan or whatever. And so they were so focused on them, they didn't think of what's the accountability to larger Russian society. Now, the accountability means that they shouldn't just say, well, Russian society thinks that immigrants shouldn't be here, or that's not it. But they didn't, the dilemma was they didn't do some kind of building awareness for what can be, to change the overall climate. They thought either in terms of let's help the migrants themselves at the point they come in, or let's go to the government and try to use connections to change the law, right? But not thinking of what can be done for society. What can be done so that the society is thinking different and becoming more welcoming? So these are examples of how the different constituencies didn't line up. And why is it a compromise sometimes? Because you only have so many resources at an NGO, and you have to figure out how you're going to allocate them. You know, everything takes resources. Even if it's like a person's time that they're going to go out and do something, they're going to do that instead of doing this. An example of where an alignment takes place, there's an organization, and it goes back when I was working in Ukraine, called the Ukrainian Step-by-Step Foundation. They were essentially a repeat of Head Start. The Soros Foundation had started this program of what here in the US is Head Start to work in other places. So they had this mission. We, the Mott Foundation, wanted to support community schools. The idea is that the school is open to the local community and helps do things for the community, and the community also is involved in the life of the school. Okay, so step by step, actually, if their mission was really kids' development, they stretched it a little to go a little older into the whole school rather than just you know, the preschool or the early grades. So this is where a thing of where I was talking about how core values sometimes may, you know, you might stretch the mission. You have to be careful so that it's not so-called mission creep to take you off of your mission, but it might be done. That was their role. They wanted to get involved in community schools. The alignment was great because the main funders, Soros and Mott, saw that this was what we wanted, and we weren't constraining them in their work. The alignment to their beneficiaries, primarily the kids, but also the community, was good. Their accountability to some of their other partners, which in this case was the Ministry of Education in Ukraine, happened to be good because the ministry thought this is a great idea. We'll even put in resources to help train teachers on how to, and school administrators on this community school approach. And it was great for civil society as a whole, the idea that people can participate and be involved. So that's an example of where it all kind of came together and aligned right. But that's not always easy for it to happen.
So is a statistical theory of change a figura? You're just making it look good?
Make it look good. So I'll tell you a story. Right? So last year I had a couple of West Point cadets and their faculty member who came to me, and they said, we do systems engineering, and we want to do a systems analysis of slavery and see if we can be of help to you. So come on in, by all means. And they picked the Democratic Republic of the Congo as sort of their case. Mm-hmm. And they came back to me after some months of working on this. And the map of causality was mind-boggling that they had come up with. It was indecipherable. There were squiggles and arrows and loops and feedbacks, and you know, it was incredible. Yeah, and you know, my response to them, and this is the reality of actually running programs, is you have to have a model that is parsimonious enough to implement and captures variables that actually make a difference. And then the proof is in the pudding, right? Because it may be true, and frankly, we don't know because there's not anywhere near enough evidence, right, about all the things that might have an impact on slavery. We have hypothesized that there's these three core interventions that we think will make a difference, right? And they're not will-o'-the-wisp. We didn't just pull them out of thin air. They're based on 15 years of experience and such research as is available. And this 3-year period, this 2014 to 2016 period, we're sort of devoting as best we can to trying to figure out, well, are we right? Are these the three things, not the three things, but are these three things that actually seem to make a significant difference in the communities that we work in? And I don't see an alternative to that other than wishful thinking. So
That's a bit like saying I believe in God because it's too discomforting not to.
no, not at all, because I mean, Descartes may have had proof of God, okay, but we're not. This is not a matter of faith. This is a matter of testing our proposition, right? We're putting out a set of hypotheses, and within the limits of our resources, we're actually trying to test if we do this. We're making a set of claims. If we provide training and technical assistance and grants to local organizations, then they will become more capable. And what we've done is we've developed what we're calling an organizational capacity assessment tool, which actually scores change in the capability of our partner organizations, the local NGOs. You may say your instrument sucks, but we're actually trying to measure whether change is taking place. And so that's the first step in the change. And then we're saying, well, if they become more capable, because they're embedded in these communities, then 3 things will happen. Communities will become educated and mobilized, they will secure better legal protections, and they will have better scores on some key socioeconomic variables, okay? Those are all measurable, right? Those are all measurable, and so we've developed a community maturity assessment tool, which actually looks at some of these key criteria to see, well, can we track change in those communities? And then the third part of this is if communities become more resistant, as defined by these variables, then the incidence and prevalence of slavery will decline. And so we've developed a slavery prevalence survey, which we've now piloted in the Congo. So now, I'm sure that as this stuff gets out, people say your instrument sucks and your method was terrible and what was your sampling, but I think we're doing a thoughtful and reasonable job of trying to test whether what we do, and that is not to deny that in some theoretical sense, excuse me, there's a welter of possible other causes. Thank you, Helen. That may be at play, but we'll find out. And I like to think that's a thoughtful and reasonable approach to running an NGO.
We have unfortunately run out of time, so I'm going to ask any of you who had questions you didn't get a chance to ask, please come up. We'll be here for another 5 or 10 minutes. I want to thank our speakers today. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and despite it being hard to be an NGO and hard to work in an NGO, I'm guessing that many of us are still going to want to do so.
Okay,
Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.